I've been thinking about this a lot. When you make bias tape, you don't need to fold and iron it. You can just start sewing on it. No need to pin it first. That is crazy, but I think that would work actually, but it feels wrong. Is this true? I've been sewing for 15 years and I've never thought about this. It does feel like it would save time, but I'm just not sure that it would yield the same results. So today I'm gonna test if not pre-pressing and folding bias tape works and works well, and I'm gonna test it in the two applications that I use bias tape the most frequently. So the first method is what I'm gonna call the applied method, where the binding is visible on both sides of the finished garment. And the second method I'll call the hidden method, where the bias tape is only on the inside of the garment, almost like a facing. I don't think those are the actual names of these, by the way. I'm just naming them this way to keep them straight in my head. Also, I'm gonna do both of these methods on curves because I feel like that's probably the most common way you'd use bias tape when you're sewing apparel. But anything I can do on a curve, I'm assuming you could do even easier if you were sewing straight lines. For example, if you were finishing a quilt. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and prepare my bias tape in both ways. One of them will be pressed and folded and the other will not. If you've never made bias tape before, I'll run through the steps to make continuous bias tape here quickly, but I'll also link a couple of tutorials, including my own. So the first step is I'm ripping the edges of my fabric to ensure that my fabric is on grain, and then I'm going to give that a press. Next, I ripped my fabric into a square shape and I'm cutting my square diagonally, and then I'll flip one side down so the straight sides match. You should sew those pieces together at a 1/4 seam allowance. I sewed mine at a 1/2 inch because I was just running on autopilot, so it came out a little bulky. And then I'll press that open, and now I'm making cut lines parallel to the long edge of my fabric, 1/4 inch apart. Then I'll bring the edges together and offset the first strip and sew that together. If you're doing this for the first time, it's gonna feel a little weird, but it'll all make sense after you start cutting. Since you offset the first strip, once you start cutting, it becomes a continuous strip of fabric. So I guess I'll stop there for my non-pressed bias tape, but for the pressed bias tape that I usually do, I'll finish it off by running it through my bias tape maker and pressing it. By the way, there are ways to make bias tape without a bias tape maker, but if you're going to be sewing a lot, I highly recommend these. It will just save you so much time. Okay, now that I have my bias tape ready, I'm going to start applying it. So the first way is the applied method. I'll start sewing the bias tape from the wrong side of the garment. And then I'll trim the bulk and fold my bias tape over so it encases the raw edge of my armhole. And then I'll top stitch it from the right side. And this is how it looks finished. Next, I'll do the hidden method. So I'll start off almost the exact same way, except I'm sewing my bias tape to the right side of the garment this time. Next, I'll trim the bulk and then fold my bias tape to the inside and sew along that folded edge. That was easy enough. It came out maybe a little bit sloppy, but if I was using matching thread, you wouldn't be able to tell. Okay, let's try the non-press side now. I'm gonna start again with the applied method, so I'm pinning this to the wrong side of the garment. So far, I like this. It's slightly easier to pin and maneuver the bias strip around since it's not folded up. Next, I'm gonna trim it and fold it. And now it's time to sew. Okay, I kinda don't like how it's getting sort of twisty, but I think that would go away when you press it. So obviously you wouldn't be able to completely skip pressing at all, but I guess it's just a preference on what step you'd like to take this to the iron. It's kind of unwieldy though, so my end result is extremely sloppy looking. Oof, I don't like how this came out. I'm a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to sewing especially, so I would immediately rip this out if this was a real project. But let's try the hidden method and see how it works out, since I feel like that's a little easier to get it looking neat since the bias tape ends up on the inside of the garment. So again, I'll just sew this starting on the right side of the garment and trim the bulk, and I actually went ahead and took this to the iron because I really wanted to give this one a fair chance. So now I'm going to fold it over and pin it in place before sewing. I will say I spent a little bit more time pinning this so that it could come out looking as neat as possible. Okay, here are the finished results. It doesn't look too bad, but I did spend a lot more effort on this to make it look nice and not foolish. Here is a side-by-side comparison and you can see how these came out again. What do you think? I feel like not pressing the bias tape could work well for non-curved applications like a quilt, for example. I really wanted to like the non-pressed bias tape, but I just found myself wishing that it had been folded already. I don't really enjoy pressing bias tape because it can get kind of fiddly, but I guess now I appreciate getting the fiddly part out of the way when it's not attached to anything. I do feel like I did a little bit better on the hidden method in the non-pressed bias tape, but I think it's because I was forced to pay attention to what I was doing, sort of how driving in a roundabout forces drivers to pay attention. But overall, I think I'm gonna stick to pressing my bias tape first before applying it. But if not pressing bias tape works for you, then I'm really happy for you and honestly a little bit jealous. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!